Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. This is our mini-series Ask the Consistory where we answer listener questions. Now, in regards to this episode, I want to address a previous video I made. A video I made back in June on the practice of lay reading and lay preaching, in which I expressed the coelc position in that we reject lay preaching, that we don't allow lay people to preach their own sermons or even to preach sermons written by pastors. And in that video I explained that there are multiple different positions held in Lutheran churches. Particularly, there are 5 positions. On one spectrum you have churches that allow lay readers to get up and preach sermons written by pastors. This is like the Missouri Synod. And on the other end, you have groups like the coelc-atc, which reject lay preaching altogether. And in between those two, you have the ELDONA and the coelc, where we allow lay reading to take place, in which we allow a lay person to lead a service, generally either matins or a recitation of Luther's catechism, following the practice of the early Lutherans. Yet in agreement with the early Lutherans, we reject lay people preaching sermons. However, in that video I pointed out that there's a difference between the coelc position and the ELDONA position. The coelc rejects the practice of lay people preaching or reading a sermon pre-prepared by a pastor. Now, ELDONA claims to hold that same view, yet they allow their lay readers to read out an expository letter, which to me sounds exactly like reading a sermon. I don't see the difference between reading an expository letter and reading a sermon written by a pastor. And I wanted to bring up the fact that I believe the ELDONA is inconsistent on their own position. So in the ELDONA's 2006 Malone Theses, Article 3, it reads, "Laymen ought not to preach or read sermons at the divine service. Laymen are not to administer the sacraments of the church. Emergency baptism is the only exception of the rule." So here you have in ELDONA's one of their foundational statements saying that they reject the practice of laymen reading out sermons in the divine service. Therefore, they would reject lay preaching in any form. Yet, as Pastor Joshua Sullivan in his Ask the Pastor videos confesses, there is a practice in the ELDONA of allowing the lay reader or kuster to read out an expository letter written by the pastor.
And there's also then the opportunity for the kuster to read a letter written by the pastor to the congregation. Generally, I'll write a letter to the congregation based on the appointed gospel lesson for that Sunday.
Now, this practice isn't necessarily held by all pastors in ELDONA, as not all ELDONA pastors have their kusters reading out these letters. But it is held and practiced by some pastors in ELDONA, and the ELDONA does not see a problem with this. I see this practice in ELDONA of having lay people read out expository letters as inconsistent with their own Malone thesis. Because there is no distinction between a lay person reading out some kind of expository letter by a pastor or him reading out a sermon written by a pastor. To me, this is just simple. This is inconsistent between the teachings and the practice of the ELDONA. Now, I'm not trying to make this video necessarily as an attack on ELDONA. I want this video to be kind of just to point out this inconsistency and also allow ELDONA the opportunity to respond. Pastor Sullivan has a YouTube channel called Ask the Pastor. I encourage him to respond to this video in his own video on his own channel, explaining how he does not see this practice of reading out a letter as being inconsistent with the Malone Theses, which rejects a lay person reading out a sermon during divine service. So I look forward to Pastor Sullivan making a response video to this video and explaining how their teachings and their practices are not inconsistent with one another, because I just see them as being inconsistent, and in the coelc we don't allow our lay readers to read a sermon. That is a form of lay preaching which is expressly rejected by the early Lutherans and most Lutherans up until probably the 1900s. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. If you haven't watched our video on lay reading and lay preaching yet, I would recommend that you go and watch that video straight away, as that gives a much more in-depth, detailed explanation of our position and gives some historical background as to why we hold to this position, where we allow lay reading but not lay preaching, including not allowing lay readers to read out a sermon written by a pastor. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.